without much more ado, I'll say that when this topic was suggested, I went online and found the National Coalition for Responsible Homeschooling, and I contacted them, and they recommended Kelley, who's a local person, and she has a pretty amazing story to relate. She was homeschooled in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, the Bible Belt, and all the way through the end of high school. And she took her first exam, the ACT exam, at the end of high school. And during high school, she had a full-time job at a horse farm and was pretty much self-educated during that time. But afterwards, she managed in fits and starts to earn a BA degree in general studies. And I'm sure that took quite a bit of gumption to do that. Her focus has been as an advocate for common sense laws to better protect children who are being homeschooled. And I think she will have some things to say about the darker sides of homeschooling from her own personal experience. And that certainly is valuable lessons can be learned there. So anyway, without much ado, I'd like you to welcome Kelley Ritchie and hear what she has to say about her experience being homeschooled, and then her experience being involved in the Coalition for Reasonable Homeschooling movement. So Kelley, if no further ado, I'd turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank you guys for having me as a guest with your organization. It's truly an honor. I was very excited just listening to you guys talk about all the things coming up. It's all stuff that really interests me personally. But as David said, my name is Kelley Ritchie. I'm 33 and I currently live in Aurora. So today we're going to discuss the topic of homeschooling in the United States, the origins of modern homeschooling, the pros and cons, the most current statistics, and the future of homeschooling. But essentially, before we get started, I would like to share a little bit about myself and my experiences as a product of the homeschooling movement, just as briefly as possible to set the stage for the talk. But my parents decided to homeschool my sisters, my brother, and me when the homeschooling movement and trend was hitting its fever pitch in the 80s. I was, like David said, taught at home until high school graduation. So we were also deeply entrenched in the Quiverful movement and Bill Gothard's teaching. Not sure if you guys are familiar with the 18 Kids and Counting show on TLC, but it kind of, I see a lot of similarities. They're a part of the Quiverful movement, but essentially our homeschool system was really ineffective. Our home life was extremely physically and mentally abusive at our mother's hand. We rarely did any schoolwork. And like he also said, we never took any tests. School and learning were an additional form of punishment she would use by withholding it from us and dangling it over our heads as if we didn't deserve an education. So I was also self-taught up until graduation. I like to credit my oldest sister with the whole reason that I made it to school in the beginning. But like David also said, I'm passionate about being a catalyst for getting effective laws passed for children across the United States. My sister Julia and I started the Family Ties podcast a year ago. And in our podcast, we cover true crime cases that involve children coming from situations where abuse, neglect, torture, and murder are involved. Our goal is to cover the stories of these children with a heavy focus on homeschooling related crimes. I personally want to make life better for at-risk children and uncover the most significant hurdles preventing the passing of these common sense laws so that we can protect our nation's children better. So now that you know a little bit about my own story, I would like to assure you guys that this talk is not going to be an entirely negative take on homeschooling. But still, my experiences will serve as a springboard for my hopes for the future of homeschooling and the reforms that are already taking place within what I call the new wave of homeschooling. But let's dig in first by discussing some current statistics to build our understanding upon. So According to the National Home Education Research Institute, movements come and movements go. Policymakers, educators, parents, and the general public have wondered for 30 years whether homeschooling would be a passing fad or trend. It has not been so. Does empirical evidence suggest that the population size is, however, experiencing a flattening or leveling of growth? People want to know, how many homeschoolers are there in the United States? Brian D. Ray, PhD, reports in his article, Homeschooling, the Research, that there were about 2.5 million homeschool students in the spring of 2019, or 3 to 4% of school-age children. The homeschool population had been growing at an estimated 2 to 8% per annum over the past several years, but it grew drastically from 2019 to 2021. Some statistics show that homeschooling rates doubled during the pandemic, while other reports indicate that the practice tripled. These reports are still a shot in the dark because we won't know what the actual numbers are for 2020 for a while to come. However, even with the complex data, we still won't have an accurate picture due to underreporting and the stealth or underground homeschooling movement, which we will talk about later on. So what is the origin story of homeschooling and when did it begin to rise in popularity? We have to go back a ways to understand the evolution from a practical form of education to an all-out movement, both politically and religiously, to an outright statistical trend. So a brief history. The earliest public schools were founded during the Reformation period, in which Martin Luther played an important role. Between the 15 and 1800s, there was a significant rise in literacy and education lacking in earlier forms of homeschooling. Homeschooling and apprenticeship remained the primary form of education until the late 1800s, when it was discovered that most people severely lacked educations. Homeschooling became less common during the 19th and 20th centuries, when a mandatory school attendance law was enacted due to the lack of educated people in society. In the 19th century, there was a rise in literacy rates, and most schooling had moved towards a classroom environment. The modern history of homeschooling, as we now know it today, begins around the 1960s. It solidifies from there as a fast-growing trend due to popular theories that gained momentum around this time. An often overlooked fact that was arguably an early incentive for parents to homeschool in the 1960s was rooted in racism. In 1952, the passing of the court's ruling on Brown versus Board of Education decided that establishing racial segregation in public schools was deemed unconstitutional, which threw many parents into a fury over the thought of their children sharing classrooms with people of color. Homeschooling was seen as the solution to this problem and a decision that allowed parents to escape to suburbia and school districting to segregate their kids away from their less desirable peers. But in the non-religious segment, this was a time where there were doubts about the efficacy, quality, or value of public learning. The writings of authors like John Holt in How Children Fail and Paul Goodman are basically in compulsory miseducation suggested that parents should start unschooling their kids. Their writings fueled the growing fears around institutionalized educations. But then in the religious sector, Rousseau's John Rushdoony, a Calvinist philosopher and theologian, started pushing for education to return to the home to combat what the religious movement saw as dangerous secularism being taught to their children. Often dubbed the father of homeschooling, he was also the father of Christian Reconstructionism. It is worth briefly breaking down the movement to understand further what happens later on to push the religious movement further into extremist territory. Christian Reconstructionism, as defined by Wikipedia, is a fundamentalist reformed theonomic movement developed under the ideas of Rousseau Rushdoony, Greg Banson, and Gary North. It has had an important influence on the Christian right in the United States. Theonomy is a hypothetical Christian form of government in which society is ruled by divine law. Theonomists hold that divine law, particularly the judicial laws of the Old Testament, should be observed by modern societies. In keeping with the cultural mandate, Reconstructionists advocate theonomy and the restoration of certain biblical laws said to have continuing applicability. These include the death penalty, not only for murder, but also for propagators of all forms of idolatry, open homosexuals, adulterers, practitioners of witchcraft, and blasphemers. So lots of fun, basically. This ideology and belief system is a critical turning point and where the homeschooling movement would remain rooted at least until the 1990s. But for many homeschooling communities, it remains the basis of belief, like where I grew up. Rushdoony's views became adopted by the religious right, the evangelical movement, and has been a springboard for the extreme ideas held by the most significant percentage of the homeschooling population. In 1969, John Holt went on to found Holt Associates in Boston. The purpose was to act as advocates for parents considering unschooling and non-traditional homeschools. In the 70s, there was an embracing of the idea that institutional learning would make children incapable of independent thought, making them brainwashed consumers who would be made less intelligent by being forced to attend school. In 1977, John Holt goes a step further by starting the publication dedicated to homeschooling called Growing Without Schooling, which was in circulation up until 2001. Between 1982 and 1993, at least 34 states had legalized homeschooling. Now, a lot happens in 1983. Michael Ferris founded the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Actually, I'm ahead of myself. A lot happened then, but let's start with Greg Harris. He's a preacher and he touts homeschooling as an opportunity for parents to pass along Christianity and raise children in a monitored, censored, and faith-based schooling environment where exposure to secularism was highly regulated. So I remember a lot of this guy growing up. Also in 1983, Michael Ferris founded the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which was a self-described Christian organization that came about to protect and represent homeschooling families, regardless of religious affiliation, legally. At this time, homeschooling was not broadly legal in all 50 states yet, so the organization established itself as the protector of families from potential harassment or legal trouble. HSLDA is primarily credited with helping to make homeschooling legal in the states. Now, skipping to the 90s, homeschooling is now legal in all 50 states, and the Homeschool Legal Defense Association continues to wield its power and influence further into the political and judicial realm. In 1994, the HSLDA was involved in a landmark court case. They lobbied successfully and defeated unpopular language in Bill HR 6, which could have potentially required the homeschooling parent to hold a teaching certificate. They were successful in defeating said bill by overloading the phone lines at Capitol Hill. This victory for homeschoolers and religious leaders was and is problematic. Without any teaching qualifications whatsoever, parents were allowed to teach multiple children of differing ages from grades K to 12, not even necessarily having graduated high school themselves. As noted by Mark Hegener, then publisher of Home Education magazine, HSLDA used homeschooling families to jump strongly on the federal side of the scale of states' rights versus federal rights. For homeschoolers, this means someday some poor federal bureaucrat is going to be stuck with the task of writing regulations which define homeschooling. Ladies and gentlemen, I firmly believe we are at that stage now in the year 2021. We will come back around to this issue in a bit. But shockingly, it took all the way until 1999 for the US Department of Education's National Council for Education Statistics to issue the very first report that attempted to quantify the number of homeschooling households in the country. This report and any reports of this nature that have followed have proven to be widely undercounted and shockingly hard to track. This premier report counted less than 2% of the student population to be homeschooled when it had only been legal for less than 20 years. Now, how common is it for Americans to ignore even the most fundamental laws in their states and homeschool under the radar? All you have to do is visit the online forum of welltrainedmind.com to see how many people find it easy to evade even the most minimal state laws for homeschooling. I urge you guys to go to the forum and read through how many people do this without any problems, allowing them to skirt around accountability or showing up on the government's radar. One commenter on the forum asked, she said, "I'm not intending to do this. I'm asking more curiosity than anything. In what states could you easily get away with flying under the radar and not complying with state laws? I'm thinking that some places you probably have to register with the local school, which would make flying under the radar schooling difficult in a small town. The school officials would notice you and notice that you hadn't registered. Other areas would be much easier to go unnoticed. In British Columbia, no one would ever know if you didn't register. We do anyways. So what states do you know about?" Just a couple of the really disturbing responses that I found were one person saying that North Carolina, they have plenty of requirements, but the state agency that oversees homeschooling is so understaffed that you'd very likely get away with not registering for quite a while, at least the first year. Or if you did register, but didn't test, they'd most likely not bother you. That was my experience for the 3 years we lived there. Things may be different now. Another one was where someone said, "Hawaii, tons of people do it here. As long as your kid has never been in the school system, it's really easy to do. Though even being official here is as simple as turning in a letter saying, I am homeschooling." One other person says, "Oregon, almost every homeschooler I know is under the radar, and there are a lot here." I could go on reading these to you, but I think you guys get the general idea. Many of the articles that I have found report that thousands of parents in the states practice an illegal form of homeschooling, referred to as stealth or underground homeschooling. I recently met a couple that had moved to Colorado, and we became friends quickly and started hanging out. During a conversation, I discovered that the male partner had been homeschooled as one of 11 growing up. He and his siblings had been born at home. None of them had birth certificates or social security numbers, and the family went to great lengths to hide the children's existence. While he didn't see anything odd about his childhood, he told stories about being told to hide when an unidentified vehicle approached their home. He also let on that there was no actual schooling that took place. He knew how to read, but the children's education had primarily been left up to them as their prerogative to pursue, much like my situation. His parents were homeschooling for non-religious reasons, but primarily as a way to evade detection by the government or local law enforcement, which they saw as dangerous, and based their beliefs solely on paranoia and fear. Another example I would like to offer up regarding stealth homeschooling is the fantastic documentary called The Wolf Pack, which came out in 2015. I'm going to see if I can get this trailer to play for you guys. I guess not. But so basically in this story, it's true, and I would recommend that you guys watch it. But it's one that's more common than we would like to believe when thinking about homeschooling. I highly recommend that you watch it and glimpse into just one of the thousands of scenarios out there demonstrating this underground stealth movement. I found my situation mirrored in reverse. There were 6 boys and 1 girl to our 5 girls and 1 boy. They were hidden in plain sight in a cramped New York apartment, while my siblings and I grew up tucked away in the farmlands of Kentucky with a lot of property. What I related to most about their story was the power of the human imagination through play acting and recreating other worlds to escape away from the mundaneness of real life and the trauma. While they were able to watch movies that I was never allowed to watch due to violence and sexual content, my siblings and I grew up on black and white classics, Technicolor musicals, and old Hollywood fare. We would recreate scenes from our favorites, playing parts, making costumes, etc., just like the boys in the wolf pack. The outdoors, though, was our most significant advantage and was our escape from the abusive home life we had. I have a very hard time imagining how difficult it must have been for these children confined to the tiny apartment in an already crammed city. No backyard, no vacations, no escape from the same faces day in and day out. I really can't overstate how important I think that the documentary is. And I encouraged my sister to watch it, and she said now she follows the boys on Instagram just to see what they're up to. So now I'm going to skip to the advantages of homeschooling because there are a lot out there. So what does society see as beneficial about homeschooling and why? This part of the conversation will have to strictly exclude the religious segment of the homeschooling population because they do not homeschool for the reasons that non-religious folks do. Non-religious homeschoolers tend to decide to homeschool in situations where the public school system is failing their child or children because maybe the child is excelling at school and outpacing their peers and needs to learn at home to keep learning at that accelerated rate that fits their need best. Maybe the child is severely bullied by others or deals with a learning disability that makes a school environment a hostile and ineffective place for them to learn in. It's also a way that many parents have been keeping their children away from harmful exposure to racism or discrimination. Another kind of motivation would be that the child may be dealing with a health issue or like severe disability where it just makes sense to do the learning in a more comfortable and safe environment. It also provides the parents a flexibility to tailor their child's education to that specific child's learning needs. Public schools could also be behind in granting technological access to their students. We saw this, with the advent of the computer. It took a lot of schools a long time to adopt that. So I think there is also that opportunity there for some parents who do place some importance upon, staying up to date and kind of their kids have some scientific interests and love technology. So one other thing is freedom for families to travel for work abroad or for experiential purposes. I've seen some families do that where the dad works overseas and they take the whole family. So in that situation, it also makes quite a bit of sense. But before looking into data gathered about the efficacy of homeschooling and testing rates, let me remind you guys to keep a skeptical view of data that comes out because it is still so underreported and it's challenging to get an accurate picture. But with that being said, Brian D. Ray, PhD, also reports in that research facts on homeschooling that the home educated typically score 15 to 30 percentile points above public school students on standardized academic achievement tests. The public school average is the 50th percentile. Scores range from 1 to 99. A 2015 study found Black homeschool students to be scoring 23 to 42 percentile points above Black public school students. So 78% of peer-reviewed studies on academic achievements show that homeschool students perform statistically significantly better than those in institutional schools. Homeschool students score above average on achievement tests regardless of their parents' level or formal education or of their family's household income. Of the smaller segment of the homeschool population that are legally registered in their state, they're sending in test scores that end up being used in studies like the ones I was just quoting from. They're typically non-religious. They're very engaged in the community around them with their children, actively involved in extracurricular activities. Dr. Ray reports that research facts on homeschooling show that the home educated are doing well, typically above average on measures of social, emotional, and psychological development. Research measures include peer interaction, self-concept, leadership skills, family cohesion, participation in community service, and self-esteem. Overall, the emotional and psychological development part of this study is encouraging, to say the least, which brings me to my favorite portrait of homeschooling in the US, done very strategically and joyfully by the 2016 indie movie, Captain Fantastic, starring Viggo Mortensen. Now, I'm assuming that this little clip isn't going to play either. No, it's not. So I was going to play a clip from the movie, but just let me give you a quick little breakdown. I think this movie depicts what children can learn in a homeschooling environment when an incredibly dedicated parent is teaching, and it provides the foundation for success. So Viggo plays a widowed father of 6 who is forced to reintegrate into society after having lived off of the grid out in the wilds of Washington state. So the word unconventional to describe how Viggo raises his children in the wild and teaches them to think critically, teaches them survival skills. They also have a really broad understanding of the systems around them. But calling it unconventional is putting it lightly. I was going to show you guys a clip where, some family members that they go to visit are kind of questioning them for their motivations on his motivations for keeping them out in the wild. They feel like the kids need to be socialized. They're not going to be up to par with kids their age. And, he calls 2 of their children in and asks them questions about the Constitution or what's the First Amendment, things of that nature. And neither of the older kids can explain any of it. And then he calls his little girl in who, I believe she's between 8 to 10. And she not only can quote it, but he asks her, okay, so you're just reciting. Tell me what this means. And she's able to break it down really beautifully. So these kids are super well educated. They're full of knowledge beyond their years. However, we come to see that, they're still children with needs for normalcy, social interaction, and involvement within a community setting. Viggo's character goes through a critical transformation that brings him to the realization that although his kids love him, they've got their basic needs met, and they're taught to understand and rationalize very complex subjects and issues, he can't necessarily provide them with everything that they need by himself. So I would highly, highly recommend you watching that movie. So, and Viggo Mortensen, you guys, he is Captain Fantastic completely. So let's talk about isolation. It's a real issue among many homeschooling families, especially in more rural environments like the one I grew up in. But over the years, I've seen many groups crop up that encourage the gathering together of homeschool families to socialize, learn, and support one another. Where I come from, all of these groups are religiously orientated, and they demand that their members or families practice Christianity or some form of religion. But as far as my research can find, secular homeschool groups and support resources have been hard to find across America. Still in the last 10 to 15 years, we're starting to see more non-religious families deciding to homeschool, which in turn demands a support group that does not require that the family must be affiliated with a church. Even at this point in history, only about 25% of all homeschoolers in the US are non-religious, but this number is growing. So this growing number of secular homeschooling families has brought to light another major issue. Where can you find a non-religious curriculum? Even today, this isn't the most straightforward answer or question to answer. The Atlantic published an excellent article in 2016 called Homeschooling Without God. And it talks quite a bit about the modern struggles of the non-religious segment of homeschoolers. So we'll continue to see the tides shift away from radical or evangelical Christians being the majority in the homeschool community. But one thing I strongly recommend is that if you or someone you know is considering homeschooling, Reach out to groups like the Coalition for Responsible Home Education for information on resources, groups in your area that won't require religious affiliation. Also make mental health and mindfulness a part of the daily routine with your children, whether they're learning from home or in the classroom. I mean, I feel like those things I can't really overstate the importance of. But let's wrap up by circling back to the beginning of the talk when we were discussing federal and state law. There are 34 states within the, with low state regulations or requirements, while 11 of those 34 states have no limitations whatsoever. So these are the states where children fall through the cracks and add to the national number of 4 to 7 children that die every day in America due to abuse, neglect, torture, or murder. Not all parents who want to homeschool are doing it for educational or religious reasons. Paranoia, fear of the government, or the desire to conceal abuse and neglect are also significant reasons children get pulled from school and disappear in states where there are little to no state regulations or systems in place to track or look into the welfare of these children. So in the states with low regulation, they simply just require parents to notify their local governance that they are homeschooling. But in many of those states, parents do not have to even declare any intent or notify anyone that they're homeschooling. There are no teacher qualifications. So no matter what the parent's level of education is, they're able to homeschool regardless. The state does mandate certain subjects to be included in the curriculum, but remember, if parents aren't even registering to homeschool, this is a relatively moot point. There are also no assessments or immunizations required in most of these low regulation states. There's just a shocking 6 states that have high regulations. Homeschool Legal Defense Association's website shows that you have several legal options in those states where you can choose to operate your homeschool program, ranging from homeschooling under the local statute, homeschooling with a private tutor, enrolling your child in a satellite, religious day school, or accredited day or boarding school. In these states, some teaching qualifications are required. The homeschool must be registered with the state. Notification of intent, required subjects, assessments, and immunization are also required. But that's only in six states out of all of us. So then there are 10 states with moderate regulations. And HSLDA says that the states with moderate regulation offer 2 options for people wanting to homeschool, where parents can choose to homeschool under the state's homeschooling statute or as a non-chartered, non-tax supported school. Notification, some kind of teacher qualification, mandated subjects, assessments, and immunization are also required in most of these states, but not all of them. There's a lot more to this, but essentially homeschooling to me seems like it should be viewed as a privilege and not necessarily as something that is a right. Regardless of my personal views on this, the fact remains that in the 60 years that homeschooling has been a popular solution to public education's failings, it has produced some alarming trends in the evangelical movement and created a more dangerous environment for children who have no tangible rights in which to expect or demand safe, loving, or stable living environments. We're in a moment in which we must drive the conversation and demand stricter laws to protect our nation's most vulnerable. As adults in America, we have the odds kind of ever in our favor when it comes to having rights, being able to vote and fight for those rights. And we take it for granted that there's a whole subset of humans in our country that have no say in their day-to-day lives or environments. Laws need to change to reflect the undeniable fact that children deserve and have a right to safe living situations, freedom from physical or emotional abuse, a well-rounded education, clean clothes and meals, and freedom from abuse, torture, and neglect. HSLDA has put decades of effort into deregulation in homeschooling laws, in defeating bills or proposals that crop up in different states that might add more oversight to homeschooling. Within that state, So they have fear-mongered their base to distrust the government, both local, state, and national, and to fear that someone is trying to take away their right to homeschool. When asked to discuss this topic with you, it felt a bit like being handed a loaded gun, because this topic is intrinsically linked with religious extremism, political animus, and strong beliefs on both sides. But I hope that you've been able to get a glimpse into the past, present, and future of homeschooling in the United States. I hope that you'll walk away with a better sense of what is excellent about homeschooling and a healthy dose of reality about what is currently wrong with homeschooling. I hope that you can see all of the potential this institution has to produce well-rounded, highly functional, and educated children that will go on to shape the world in which we live. But regardless, if you or someone you know is interested in or already does homeschool, as adults, let's ask ourselves, what can we do to make the lives of children in our communities safer, healthier, allow them to be more curious, encourage them to be more curious, and more prepared to tackle the future than we were? There's so much more to this topic that I'm highly passionate about and want to share as much as possible with those who are curious about it. I'm eager to hear your thoughts and questions on what was just discussed. I'm also interested in hearing about your hopes for the future of homeschooling and what it would take to reach that future goal. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Kelley. That was very informative and very interesting. And I'm going to go watch those movies just to see what you're talking about, because it sounds some very dramatic stories are being told out there. I have had a couple of questions, but first I want to encourage people to use the chat to submit questions that I'll repeat for Kelley to respond to. But one question that came up is, how do we assure that homeschool students meet proper educational standards? For example, in the teaching of science, the obvious one is biological evolution, for example. What is there in any of these laws, and particularly here in Colorado, to ensure that there's a balance in what homeschool kids are taught in terms of science?
Well, that's a really I have a disappointing answer for you, because I mean, currently I was raised as a creationist, and only now in my adult life have I been just gobbling up as much science and facts as possible. But, you know, as a homeschooling family, you get to decide and choose what curriculum you're going to use. And since most of them out there are religious in nature, you're going to get mainly something with that, like my science. I loved science, but I mean, the amount of stuff that was excluded is just extraordinary. And being taken to see Ken Ham and listen to all of his talks, it's up to the parents, and they get to completely decide this. And when you have states that don't require testing, we just won't know. We just don't know.
That's interesting. Do you know how it is here in Colorado then? Do homeschool students, for example, have to take any standardized tests?
Well, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association page, if you go to it, it lays out the US, and Colorado and Kentucky are both on the low regulation end. But Colorado does have a little bit more meat to the bones, but there's still no assessments that are required. And essentially all that they have to do here is state that they're homeschooling, you know, with a letter of intent. And I think that they recommend that you have like a curriculum that you're going to use. And that's about it. No one checks in later. And that's what the Homeschool Legal Defense Association is there for. We had social services called on my mom several times. They never made it inside the door because all she had to do was call the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and they will cover everything from there. They'll take care of it. And it's It's scary because, I mean, there's plenty of resources out there to protect the parents, but absolutely nothing to ensure that the children are actually getting an education.
All right. I think we have time. There's another question. Do children have any right to petition the court or a court for an order requiring them to be allowed to attend public school?
That is a very good question, because I know there was one situation in the homeschool group that I grew up in where one of the boys decided he wanted to go to high school, and his parents didn't want that, but he basically said that he would report them if they did not allow it. So he kind of went about his own way in making that happen. But it's not, I think the key here is just to remember that even in states that do have decent regulations, if you're going under the radar, you're not even ending up on any of the statistics. So you can't get a really accurate read on how many people are actually homeschooling, or how many kids are just living under the radar and don't have birth certificates. It's really hard to track and find out that information.
Interesting. And another question, how do your siblings view homeschooling? Do they have similar views that you do, or not? And kind of a related question then, how is a homeschool person evaluated to get into a college, for example, without school transcripts? So those are two separate questions.
Well, starting with the last one, Homeschool Legal Defense Association also provides the high school transcripts. So my mom completely fabricated my entire high school transcript. I didn't take Algebra 1 and 2. No, I didn't take geography. Like all of these different things, it's really easy for parents to just be like, yeah, they took this, they took that. These are the grades that they made. And they'll send you the paper, the printed out paper. But my best friend I've known since I was 2 years old, she was homeschooled. She's still extremely religious. We're still best friends. We just disagree a lot. But she homeschools her 3 kids. And I did a practice run of this with her just to see, okay, does it feel fair enough? Does it feel as if I'm just completely taking a major dump on homeschooling? And, you know, I could tell, you know, parts of it, like being a religious person, it probably offended her somewhat, but she didn't say anything. She just, she kind of gave her opinion on some stuff that she thought should be removed. And it tends to be my political views. So I removed that. But having her opinion on it was important to me because she's all for it. She's all about it. And I'm kind of amazed that she does feel that way. But my siblings, it's extremely interesting because there's 6 of us. Half of us are super to the left and half of us are super to the right. But we all can agree on the fact that we just, we would have loved to go to school. My oldest sister, she has a double master's. She's super driven and she's done it all herself. So I find that extremely inspiring.
Another question, real quick. We're kind of running out of time, so this is a brief one, I think. As humanists, we're interested in the non-religious secular homeschoolers. Have you spoken to any of them and know much about how they're building their communities, or if that's a rising trend that's going to counterbalance the religious side?
Well, it should be, I mean, with 25%, that still overwhelmingly shows that it skews more towards the religious side, but that is growing. And I think because of COVID, we're going to see these numbers just skyrocket. And I think a lot of people have just realized that it's a great opportunity to be able to tailor their child's education. Maybe their child just learns better that way. But I think that number is continuing to rise because I do think that the amount of, even church going has gone down. So we're seeing a shift in the opposite direction. So I think it's going to continue to go where maybe eventually it'll even out. It may never go where there's more secularism than religious, but I think it'll eventually even out within the next 10 years even.
All right, and we have time for one more question, I believe. It's more personal. Did you have to divorce yourself from your parents or family in taking the path that you are on now? And also, in that same vein, the book Educated by Tara Westover that we read in the book group, do you know people like Tara Westover who actually got estranged from their families and embracing a different kind of education in society?
Yeah, I love that book, by the way. A friend recommended it to me. And some of it felt scarily similar, some of the experiences, but I do know there are I met a few families that were secular homeschoolers, but they weren't allowed in our homeschool group because in order to be in the homeschool group I was raised in, you had to make a declaration of faith. That was just across the board. But I think, like we talked about, now in the past 10 years, I've seen there's been a shift towards more of like, okay, so is there a curriculum I can use? Even in 2016, when that Atlantic article was written, it was still very hard for parents to find a good curriculum that had a robust science and in math. Those are two things that were completely just disregarded in our neck of the woods. But you did see a lot of people who, I think I met maybe three families total that were secular, but I think that had more to do with my parents and where we were than the actual amount of secular homeschoolers.
All right, well, thank you. I think unless there's some really pressing questions that people want to raise their hand and ask you directly, I'll pass it back to Matthew for any closing remarks. And again, I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time and being with us and sharing your experiences.